The Sky's Embrace, Chapter 5, Riding the Tempest. Master Bromont, set course. What the blazes? Baako jumped back. Spritz was hovering by his face. For her part, the pixie remained in place as her translucent wings flashed with red lights. Her tiny expression was severe. Baako snapped. Master Bromont, kindly get your bedeviled pixie under control. Bromont watched the interaction with quiet bemusement. My apologies, Captain. Once Spritz gets her dandery up, it's a mite hard to rein her in. Baako schooled his expression. And what, pray tell, does she want? Bromont frowned and looked away, trying to avoid the question. Baako was not having it. Well, begging your pardon, Captain, but I believe she wants to know why you were so irritable with the Windsinger. I am not irritable, Baako snapped. He glared at the pixie. But if she wants to see what my irritation looks like, she should, by all means, stay in my direct proximity. Spritz's wings flashed gold as she zoomed backward. A frightful expression etched on her face. She landed on Bromont's opposite shoulder. Bromont chuckled and rubbed her head with the absent finger. Kindly tell that creature of yours to mind her own affairs, Baako told him briskly. I should try, Captain, said Bromont. He glanced at the pixie on his shoulder. You heard the captain. Mind your own business. Spritz pressed her little hand on the large man's cheek, her wings flashing in an assortment of colors. Bromont chuckled. What's she saying? Baako demanded. Bromont shrugged, bucking the irritated pixie slightly. She's more or less expressing her opinion of your need for personal space, Captain. Baako sighed as he let the matter drop. Bromont was a solid sailor, even if his choice of companions was something left to be desired. Adjust course for 40 degrees to starboard. Aye, Captain, setting course for... Bromont froze. He stared at Baako with wide eyes. But, Captain, our current trajectory will take us directly to McSteed's farm. 40 degrees to north will take us directly over the... Baako cut him off. I am well aware of our trajectories, Master Bromont. Our new course will indeed take us over the drop-off. Behind Bromont, Jolovich gasped. Baako ignored him. Windsinger Featherheart has been kind enough to implore her goddess for favorable winds. I see no reason why we shouldn't aid her efforts. If we skim the edge of our branch, we can increase our speeds tenfold. Understood? Bromont licked his lips nervously as he croaked. Aye, Captain. Setting course for 40 degrees to starboard. Baako nodded, then he turned the signal cranks on the forward's railing. On the deck before him, Zephani glanced at him wide-eyed. It was his turn to freeze. There was no way she could have heard his remarks to the helmsman over the distance in the wind. Yet she gave him one trembling nod of understanding. Before Baako could respond, she started to sing again. The signal bells erupted across the deck. The crew stared at the klaxon as they tried to recall what the signal meant. Baako watched as the swiftest among them reacted first. Hendricks nudged his nearby companions questioningly. Next to him, Spider stiffened as he looked from the continental edge to the captain. Baako met his eyes over the distance and nodded. Baako's voice boomed across the deck. Set course for 40 degrees to starboard. He paused momentarily to allow the crew to calculate their trajectory. In the sails above them, more men gasped. Baako shouted, Prepare to skim the edge! A keen exploded up from the lower deck's ladder as if he was fired from a ballista himself. He shot across the deck, adding his own shouts to the captains. Secure your lines! Tighten those sails! Secure the ballistae! Prepare for the goddess's winds to blow right up our... His gaze met Zephani's as the latter sang, Backs, he finished lamely. Stephanie grinned, but kept swinging. Akin shook his head wryly before he turned and headed for the aft castle. As Baako watched him approach, he felt the winds behind him grow fiercer. The ship was picking up speed as it barreled toward the void. Akin took the stairs 2 at a time. "Captain." Baako nodded. "Lieutenant?" Akin leaned in and lowered his voice. "Captain, you want to have the crew skim the edge, sir?" Baako said. "Yes, Lieutenant." "But Captain, we never skimmed the edge before, sir." "I'm aware of that, Lieutenant. But we have drilled the crew for this possibility, have we not? So there is a precedent and a need for haste." "Aye, sir." Akin's marred expression didn't look convinced. "Daniel." When the lieutenant looked at him, Baako said, "It will be okay." Akin took a deep breath and said, "Aye, sir. Where would you like for me to be?" "Go to the lower deck," said Baako. "I'm sure Master Benz is more than capable, but check to see if he could use an officer's reassuring presence and an extra set of hands. After that, go where you feel like your help will be needed most." Akin saluted and headed for the lower deck's portside ladder. Baako watched him go grimly. In truth, Baako didn't blame his lieutenant nor his crew for their uncertainty. Having a cloud ship sail anywhere near the continental drop-off was no small feat. The winds around the drop-off could be unpredictable and volatile. On the edge, the wind force could outstrip the strength of a storm. Sail out into an air curtain at the wrong angle or time, and a downdraft could blast a ship headlong into the ground. Conversely, a vessel could be thrown spiraling out into the void, where it would disappear into the darkness below. However, for a ship that needed speed, that prepared its sails correctly, could zoom along the continental branch at an unprecedented rate. The key was the angle of entry and how the sails were cut. To do that, they would need a guide. Baako opened one of the lids of the speaking tubes and pulled its adjoining signal rope. Across the deck, he watched Spider open the lid of his tube. Without preamble, Spider said, "Forward ballista." "Master Spindel, arm a long-range harpoon into the forward ballista," Baako ordered. "Aye, Captain. I already have one in hand." The older sailor held up a long harpoon. "Very good, Master Spindel. Await my signal of 3 short bells to prime the long-range harpoon and aim it 7 degrees to port. Fire it on a 4th independent bell." "Aye, Captain. Awaiting 3 short bells to prime the long-range harpoon. Fire on the additional bell." Baako closed the lid and straightened up and stood stoically in place. He watched the Maiden close in on the edge. Other than Stephanie's beautiful singing, the deck was silent. Many of them watched the edge grow fearfully. Some bowed their heads to pray to the parent gods. A few glanced at Baako for any semblance of a reaction. For his part, Baako ignored them as he stood still as a statue and watched the edge get closer and closer. Unlike most of them, he had years of experience at stamping down the fear that threatened to scale the cliffs of his indifference. He knew firsthand what could happen if a ship failed to skim the edge correctly. He was a junior officer on one such vessel that grappled with that fate. If it weren't for the quick thinking of a seasoned sailor who pulled him over into a hovering life raft, Baako and a few other lucky souls would have been lost with the ship. It was the one reason he had insisted on training his crew on combat maneuvers when he took his post on the Maiden. His crew and even Lieutenant Akin did not know it then, but they were being trained for occasions such as now. Nevertheless, with so much ground to cover in their training, he could not thoroughly go over every technique. He only drilled them on skimming the edge a few times and never using the actual edge. He opened his spyglass and observed the outlines of a giant island-sized leaves of the mountain-sized vines that dangled above and below the horizon line. As he watched, the winds beyond the edge of the continental branch grew steadily louder. "Master Jolovich," Baako called over his shoulder. Captain? Answered the young sailor. When we hit the edge, the stability of this ship mostly falls onto your shoulders. It does? Squeaked Jelovich. Steady, lad, Baako said reassuringly. You can handle this task. Jelovich straightened up and snapped off a quick salute. Aye, sir. Good man, Baako nodded. Baako turned and looked up the deck at the forward ballista. Unlike many of his fellows, Spider did not watch the encroaching vastness of the abyss, but kept his eyes on the captain. Baako nodded and turned the signal for 3 short bursts. Spider turned around and snapped at his crew. Turn the forward ballista 70 degrees to port, 30 degrees to the deck. 70 degrees to port, 30 degrees to the deck. The 3 large men, including Hendricks, called back as they moved in unison. Baako watched as the ballista crew worked together in a fluid synchrony unmatched by few others he had witnessed in his long career. They unclamped the ballista's locking mechanism and cranked it around until it aimed portside off the bowsprit. Hendricks pushed the locking lever back in place with a heavy thunk. Locked, he called. Prime the harpoon, called Spider. Another large crewman, Vento Scales, used the blunt end of his hand axe to strike a cylindrical structure in the middle of the harpoon shaft. The harpoon resonated with a metallic ting as it hovered ever so slightly off the ballista's ammo seat. Baako cranked, and the bell of the klaxon rang once more. Spider shouted, Firing! He pulled the lever. The ballista convulsed as it shot the harpoon out into open air. The missile zoomed ahead of the Maiden without showing any signs of descending. From its place on the aft castle, Baako raised his spyglass and tracked the harpoon's progress grimly. The crew seemed to hold its collective breath as it flew closer and closer to the continental edge. It shot over the edge. The harpoon suddenly tumbled up violently as a gale of the powerful updraft blasted it skyward. Several crewmen gasped and cried out in surprise. Even Zephanie's song faltered as she watched the harpoon lurch upwards in a mingle of fascination and horror. Baako didn't utter a sound as he watched the harpoon flail out of sight. He was silently calculating the trajectory against the angles of the ship. His teeth clenched tighter as he finished his mental computations. He had expected the harpoon to react to the wind. He had never seen one sail out over the edge without doing so. However, the pure force in which the wind struck was much stronger than he expected. Masters Bromont, cut hard to port! Bromont was turning the wheel the instant the order left his lips. Baako evaluated the distance. There's no way to avoid the force of the wind from the edge altogether. He called back to the harpist loudly, so that his voice could carry over the deck. Master Jelovich, deck angle 70 degrees. He cranked the klaxon's codes and shouted, Half sheets on portside sails! Akeen's voice roared as he burst up from the below-deck ladder. Half sheets to portside! Even as the lieutenant sprinted across the deck, the Maiden lurched to the side. Men on the sails were scrambling to pull their lines in tight to secure them in place, even as the wind, volatile and uncontained, roared louder and louder. In the middle of the deck, Stephanie, still unrestrained and free, lifted her arms high, eyes closed, and continued to sing. Baako gripped the edge of the railing before him as he watched the oncoming maelstrom. He turned one of the cranks 3 times. In response, the klaxon of 3 fast, high-pitched bells rung out over the deck. The unmistakable alarm was taught to every sailor on their first day of any cloud ship of the sailing guild. Everyone knew what it meant, but Akeen's gravelly voice roared its meaning all the same. Brace for impact! With no regard for his own safety, Akeen dashed for the nearby speaking tubes and threw up the final lid. Ben's booming voice answered at once. Lower deck! Akeen roared, Brace for impact! Aye, sir. Akeen looked up in time to see the blackness of the abyss loom across the horizon before the world roared around him. He looped an arm around the railing right as the Maiden swerved out over the edge. The violent gale slammed into the starboard side of the ship, catapulting it upwards. Men cried out in surprise as they were tossed up against their harnesses. Most held true, jolting them back down. A few knots slipped, pitching their sailors forcefully from their positions. On the forward ballista, Hendricks and Scouse snatched a screaming comrade from being thrown skyward and forcefully hauled him back down. The Maiden threatened to pitch over into a violent roll. Baako tried to shout back at the harpist, but a jet of wind blew his voice back down. Beside him, Bromont braced his feet against the railing's foot ramps as he fought to hold the thrashing wheels steady. Spritz buried herself under the large man's vest as the vicious winds pummeled them. Light exploded from her wings as she did the pixie equivalent to scream to her gods for mercies. Jolovich did not look back at the captain for orders. He gripped the harp panel with his legs as his hands flew over the strings. He played the instrument not according to his orders, but his instincts. The resonance chamber of the starboard side vibrated, and the ship shook as its core fought to right itself against the torrential forces that threatened to fling it in an uncontrolled spiral to the ground. Up and down the ship, men screamed, prayed, or gritted their teeth against the elements. Lieutenant Akin was among the latter as he battled to maintain his untethered, precarious grip on the railing. On the lower deck, crewmen were thankful for the ambassador's early admonishment as they prayed that their harnesses held fast as they faced the full force of the Tempest's fury, unshielded by the hull. Most hugged the railing for support, even as a few of their feet dangled skyward. Ayo was among them. His voice was drowned out in the wind as he screamed a prayer to Lasima. Benz not only clutched the railing with his arms and legs, but he encompassed the neophyte sailor Pearson in the same embrace, using his considerable bulk to hold the pair of them down. Everyone felt the ship's lumber vibrate violently as the resonance chamber battled the gale for supremacy. Jolovich's hands plucked and worked to maintain control, but not outright ran back against the force of the Tempest. He could not hear the vessel's planks creak over the roar of the wind, but he was acutely aware of their unsettling vibrations. His face pressed against the side of the harp, shielding it slightly from the wind. Even as he plucked the strings, he whispered an urgent plea to the ship itself. "Come on, lady. You can do this. You ride the wind. The wind does not ride you. Hold out for us. Hold out for me." On the deck, unmoved and unbothered by the wind's fury or the pitching deck, Zephany stood almost statuesque. If anything, she was beaming as she continued to sing with a mad gleam of pure joy in her eye. Her strange lyrics struck a fever pitch, an instant before she slammed the butt of her staff on the deck. All at once, the wind ceased. The ship threatened to roll over the opposite way, but Jolovich instantly corrected his playing. Zephany spun around and shouted up to Baako, slightly breathless but urgent. "Captain, drop full sails!" Baako took the measure of her words in intent in an instant. His voice boomed. "Do as she says! Full canvas!" He cranked the corresponding signal on the klaxon and verbally relayed the order to the lower deck. Zephany took a deep breath and swept her staff around. The gale-force wind struck again, but this time not at their side, but at their backs. The Maiden lurched forward as her sails instantly ballooned outward, hurling them forward at an unprecedented speed. Zephany leaned against her staff, panting. "Maintain course, Master Bromont. Make adjustments as needed to stay on the edge." "Yes, sir," answered Bromont. "I'll keep her flying true." Baako nodded. "I know you will, Master Bromont. Incidentally, how's your little friend faring?" Bromont chuckled good-naturedly. "She's still quivering a bit. I think she might have watered my shoulder if you catch my meaning, sir." He's about to shrug, but he thought better of it, glancing at the pixie-sized bulge hiding in his harness. "I'll give her some berries in a bit to calm her. She'll be okay in no time." Thank you for asking, sir. Baako glanced back at Jolovich, who was readjusting his footing before the heart panel. Master Jolovich? Aye, Captain, answered the young sailor. Maintain altitude and even pitch, Baako ordered. Aye, Captain. Maintaining altitude and even pitch, he repeated. Master Jolovich, Master Bromont, you both performed your duties admirably. Thank you, sir, said Bromont. Jolovich nodded and smiled gratefully. Baako nodded back, suppressing his own smile. All at once, the mood on the ship shifted dramatically. Sailors who had been terrified for their lives moments before were whooping and cheering as they watched the landscape zoom by. On the lower deck, Benz laughed aloud as he watched treetops zoom past. He heartily slapped young Pearson on the back. This is what a ship like the Maiden was built for, lad. Pearson beamed as he watched the blurred scenery. This is amazing! Movement in his periphery pulled Pearson's attention around to the abyss below. He gasped. What's that? Benz shifted his gaze to where the young sailor pointed. What's what? The question died in his throat. Gliding on the winds with the ease that belied the wind's severity was the black form of a shadow wing. It stared up at them with its inscrutable red eyes. Benz said solemnly, It's a shadow wing. Pearson's hand flew to the handle of his hatchet. By the parent gods, are they gonna attack us? In all my long years on this ship, we have never been attacked by any shadow wings, Benz told him. Really? Benz nodded. Truly. He paused for a moment, considering the young man's words. What do you mean, they? I only see the one. Pearson shook his head. No, sir. I count 3. He pointed them out to Benz, and the older man's eyes bulged as he silently remembered something he had once heard. On the aft castle, Baako watched the crew cheer with a small smile, but no more. He enjoyed the velocity as much as the youngest sailor with scarcely a turn of service under their belt. However, he was also mindful of what they might be speeding towards. As they drew closer to their destination, a deep sense of foreboding began to dig its claws into his chest. He was afraid they were not going to like what they found. Regardless of her occupants' cheers or concerns, the Maiden's arrow sailed on the edge of the Tempest to their destination. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Sky's Embrace. If you're interested in other works by Christopher Chancy, feel free to check out his website at christopherchancy.com or consider supporting him at patreon.com/ChristopherChancy. Until next time, keep your eyes to the sky.